Ultimately, what we found, both with our initial analysis and with the more general analysis, is in general, we did not find statistically anything that we could point to as a sort of a specific, consistent abnormality or unusual pattern that leapt out at us and said, this is really something that is way out of the ordinary, and therefore there's some public health action that ought to result as a consequence. We did identify some cases where we're going back to look again because we have questions about the findings, but the findings were not of a sufficient magnitude to justify anything at this point other than going back and looking in more detail.
All that we can say is that using the Maryland Cancer Registry as the data source, using the years used, which is the entire number of years that the Maryland Cancer Registry has been in existence, looking for the groupings of cancer that we looked at, looking in a certain geographic area, that there's no cancer cluster. And actually then in our most recent public meeting, which was in October, there was for lymphoma in a particular area and time period where we do want to explore further because there was a statistically significant increase in the rate of lymphoma. Previously, lymphoma and leukemia were grouped together. So I guess that's really the long answer to saying that when the newspaper headlines would say there's no cancer cluster, that's not really accurate.
It is the saddest thing I've ever witnessed. You've got the state of Maryland trying to put together evidence that there's no cancer cluster. Number one, they've admitted many, many times they don't have the finances. That's number one. Secondly, what they're doing is so antiquated and archaic. It's like cavemen writing on walls. They are not up to the 21st century with technology. I don't know if I want to call it a conspiracy, and I don't like to say that they're incompetent. I think they are shallow-minded. I think that because their finances are limited, number one. Secondly, they live in almost like a bubble because they all get together prior to any meetings. They talk about what their findings are going to be, etc. And after all this, here's what they decided to come up with. After all of this that we brought forward, they came up with it's inconclusive. I mean, after everything's done, there's no conclusion or decision either way, which is very sad. It's very sad to me. So you have people dying in Frederick, and our health department, think about this, says, well, we're not really sure.
A lot of my concerns were people that were exposed and were around the stuff in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of those people died in the 70s and 80s, and none of that data is available in that investigation. So, we can say that, okay, from 92 to 2000, X number of people developed cancer. But there was an awful lot of people that there's no one to speak for now that died prior to that. And that kind of invalidates their findings.
The investigation was certainly not designed to fail. The investigation was designed to use the best available tools that we had in order to answer the question. And we acknowledged with the community that, in fact, if you were to try to go backwards, that is to say, to try to look at cancer rates in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's no practical way of doing that based on the data that we have available to us today. You'd have to go back, and certainly the state didn't have the capacity to go back, and not only would you have to identify all the cancer cases, but you'd also have to recreate those populations and figure out how many people actually lived there. And tracking those people down, many of whom would have either died or moved out of state or not be easy to find, you're talking about an investigation that is hugely expensive. We're talking millions of dollars, thousands of person hours worth of time to be able to do that. And even at the end of that, it would have been very challenging to try to do that kind of assessment. So we acknowledge the limitations, and you have to sort of, and we talked with the community about what that meant. And I agree with the community, and I agreed at the time that it's not a perfect answer. It was the best answer that we could provide under the circumstances.
A critical data gap here, and just with almost any other investigation I've done, is that there isn't a lot of information about historical exposures, and no amount of additional resources is going to let me go back in the past and understand what those exposures were.
But our main conclusion was that it was not really possible to tell whether that tiny population potentially affected was in fact affected adversely by the exposures. It just can't be done. Well, I would add one thing. The committee was not happy about coming to this indeterminate conclusion. We really wrestled with it. We wanted to come up with a clear yes or no, but found it was simply not possible.